A lot has changed in the NFL in just the opening 2 weeks of the NFL season. It has been, I guess every year there's things that change at a rapid pace, but this season, as Shawn, it feels like more than ever before. We have seen changes in directions through injury, change in directions through play, change in directions for a lot of reasons. So we are going to talk through about what does it mean, what now, what next, what should you do with your rosters. Is there other players that you want to pick up and add to your lineups based on those injuries? Is there players who maybe that you felt the season isn't going too well for them now that maybe there's QB changes and things like that? Does that mean that they are going to turn things around? So we are going to talk through a number of scenarios, give our thoughts and what we could do potentially moving forward. Shawn, we did our Monday recap show earlier this week for RotoViz Overtime. Hopefully people have had a chance to listen in to that one. I do want to highlight as well that over the last couple of days up on the RotoViz YouTube channel, also on RotoViz Radio, we have had Dave Cabin do some of the RotoViz tools tutorials. So he's working through some of the tools and apps that are up on rotoviz.com and giving you some insights into using them. Shawn, sometimes I talk to subscribers and they ask about a tool or where do we find the information that we talked about on the show. And I feel a lot of people go to the site, they read the articles and they want to consume the content, but there is that whole additional part with all the tools that are available. So Dave doing fantastic work there. I would recommend people check them out. And Blair Andrews and Kevin Safraniak also have started up a weekly waiver wire stream up on RotoViz YouTube channel. And they also will be posting that up on the flagship channel as well, the RotoViz Radio main feed. So check that out before your waivers each and every Tuesday. That one will be airing. I would recommend checking that out. But Shawn, we are ready to go here, looking ahead to NFL Week 3. There is a lot to talk about. How are you getting on today?
Good. We got waivers this afternoon. We have the Zero RB Universe coming out. You and I have a guillotine show that we will do for Friday, and I had an article come out on that yesterday. So much cool stuff happening. As you mentioned, the tools are fantastic. Dave's tutorials are going to really help you out with that. The value of that part of the package is really pretty insane. If you were to subscribe to a lot of those stat packages separately, you'd be talking about thousands of dollars.
It also lets you dive into stuff that you may be thinking, what's happening here? What's the numbers there? Rather than just reading it. If somebody writes about it, you can go in and dig into it yourself.
Exactly. So a meaningful part of your subscription does come through the tools, and Dave helping people out get more familiar there. I think that's really cool. Colm, a lot of injuries. One of the things that has been, so really I think we have three parts for me when we're looking at the first 2 weeks of the season. Number one is that a huge number of the players that we were excited about have hit. That has been extremely exciting. Number two, a lot of guys have gotten hurt. Many of the players that we were on, a few players that we haven't been on, certainly losing Isaiah Pacheco for those managers and for the Kansas City Chiefs is a big blow and a sad development. And then the third piece would be this kind of combination of quarterbacks really struggling and a few individual running backs blowing up as they face, I would say, apocalyptically bad run defenses. One of the games that we saw that in this last week was Packers-Colts. Your Green Bay Packers have one of the worst run defenses that I've ever seen. It's still way better than the Indianapolis Colts on the other side of the ball. We've got some other defenses out there like that. And it's kind of all part and parcel of this new dynamic or evolving dynamic that has occurred over the last several years, where teams realize that stopping the run is almost completely beside the point. If anything, you want to encourage the opponent to run, whereas you want to stop the pass. Teams have been almost completely incapable of throwing the ball down the field. There's been a lot of criticism of young quarterbacks. We have the benching of Bryce Young. Certainly our guy, Bo Nix, has struggled to move the ball. Anthony Richardson played about as poor a game as anyone will ever play. But in some ways it's unfair to, I think, be holding those players accountable when we just got one of the worst performances of Patrick Mahomes' career. You're looking at a team like the Cincinnati Bengals appears to have not held a practice so far before playing a couple of games. Josh Allen, I mean, a lot of credit is currently going to the Bills because their opponents have been so terrible, but the Bills have absolutely no passing game. CJ Stroud and the Texans looked awful. Brock Purdy, moved the football and got some good stats for George Kittle and Deebo Samuel in that game. But we have witnessed the problems that they've had without Christian McCaffrey there to help bolster the passing game on some of these plays where you're just trying to bridge the gap to the next play. We now have Deebo Samuel out. Brandon Ayuk, because he hasn't practiced, isn't ready. What's that offense going to look like? Suddenly this idea that Brock Purdy is an MVP type of candidate, or that the MVP performance was in some way on him, as opposed to basically just the exact same thing that we've gotten from 49ers quarterbacks in the past. Now, that's not looking particularly good. Dak Prescott has been very, very poor. Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars are continuing the slide that started last season. Aaron Rodgers continually wasn't ready when the play clock ran out. I mentioned the other day that he looked like he was putting on some type of Phillip Rivers impersonation there, but worse than Rivers, because Rivers always wanted to snap it at like 0.5 seconds after the clock had run out. The Jets were getting down to 0, and Aaron Rodgers still wanted to do like 5 more things. And they had to be like, no, dude, like we're going to have to start this whole thing over. You committed a delay of game. So it's not just the young guys who are struggling. Everybody is struggling. And the interesting, I say everybody, Derek Carr and the New Orleans Saints, they are not struggling. They've looked absolutely fantastic. Love to see what they are doing. Kyler Murray has been weird, but obviously the Arizona Cardinals were able to move the ball and score last week.
Baker's moving the ball pretty well.
Yeah, one of the things that was kind of interesting about that game, Colm, explain this one to me as we kind of get going here. Because I watched this game, and as you're watching the game, you're trying to understand like how Detroit isn't up by 3 or 4 touchdowns. And then you're thinking, okay, well, maybe I just was, viewing it through rose-colored glasses. Obviously, I'm a Detroit Lions. But this is a game in which the Lions ran 83 plays to 47 for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And they averaged 1 yard per play more than Tampa Bay, and they still lost. And it is a game, obviously, where they committed 2 turnovers to just 1 for the Bucs, but 463 yards to 216. One of the things I was thinking in the aftermath of this is, okay, well, Baker Mayfield has had 2 good games. You go back and look at it, and you're like, well, I mean, Chris Godwin has had 2 good games. Maybe not Baker Mayfield. Now, he did average almost 10 yards per attempt, but, I mean, the playmaking, arguably not really there.
The way, Shawn, I think this game played out is, you mentioned the plays. It felt like when you were watching it that the Lions felt like they were in the lead. They were playing with kind of a comfortability level, I think, that they were just going to walk in and win this game. And a part of that is, I've talked a good bit about teams settling for field goals, and you get into a first quarter in this game where, the 58-yard drive for the Buccaneers, they settle for a field goal. Then they have a very short 7-yard drive. I've also talked about teams getting into situations where, complete, even 2 rushes for 3.5 yards, and this situation gets you into a field goal option. So there's a field goal, there's 6-0 up. Then we get a 22-yard field goal for the Lions. Then we get another field goal for the Lions. And then that means that we're, halfway through the second quarter, we get a touchdown to Chris Godwin. But I think sometimes teams are like, well, it's going to be a low-scoring game. We're going to settle for these field goals, and we'll see what happens at the end. But the trouble is then if you give up a touchdown and you can't get into the end zone, the game slips away from you pretty quick when these teams are trying to rush the ball, trying to run out the clock, and then you're in a situation where you can't get it back at the end of the game. I thought that the Lions played very conservatively throughout this one in terms of, they had 16 points at the board at that point, and they really didn't feel like they were pushing their best players into advantageous situations to try and go and win the game. Do you think I'm out on that? There was also a couple of plays where, the playmakers have to go and, make those completions to put them in better situations as well.
Yeah, this game in many ways came down to a play that happened early on where Jameson Williams tries to run a crossing pattern, but is completely wrapped up by the defensive back. Jared Goff throws to the open spot that Williams would have emerged into if he is not flagrantly held. Because he's not there, the pass goes directly to a Tampa Bay defensive back for an interception. I mean, you have to call that penalty, and yet the Lions at home should be good enough, and they did dominate this game to the extent where that can't be the thing that beats you. Now, he throws another interception late. They also have a drive that ends on downs, kind of illustrating, again, this issue of putting yourself in a bad situation to where you do have to go for it there. But this is a 13-play, 76-yard drive where they're running out the clock on themselves, and in the end, they're not able to pick up the 4th and 8. You have another drive that ends on downs as the game is ending. A lot of yards for the Lions. Potentially, you would have gotten more volume from the Bucs if they had been in a game situation where they needed that. But one of the problems that they run into again here is that on the 17 carries from Bucky Irving and Rachaad White, they gain only 40 yards. There's always a chance that Bucky Irving is not the solution, but Rachaad White more or less has to be benched. This offense is just too one-dimensional. It allows you to do things like go out there and take Mike Evans out of this game. He's another player where if you look at this 1-2 punch, you look at this combo, you're expecting Evans to probably be the guy. And yet Chris Godwin has gotten open much more easily, and probably, again, is not going to be the focal point of defensive attention. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves as we continue along this season. On the Lions side, very easy to note that the lack of involvement from Sam Laporta was probably the difference.
Yeah, so to go back to our initial premise for the show, we did jump in there to try and fix some things that maybe have gone wrong for the Lions. The other part of that Lions performance was the previous week they go to overtime in another game where it felt like they didn't really try and put the pedal to the metal and maximize some of those plays. But Shawn, the big news in terms of non-injuries over the last 24 hours has been that Andy Dalton will now be the starting quarterback for the Carolina Panthers. Talked on Monday about some of the issues with Bryce Young. He has really struggled. The team has struggled. I think there's parts of this that are not necessarily completely on him, but he has been very, very poor. And particularly when you stretch that out over the course of his NFL career, it's hard to really argue with the team's decision other than what they've invested in him and to try and develop him. But Andy Dalton comes in, and I feel like for the team in general, in terms of the players that we're hoping to score fantasy points and the likes of a Deontay Johnson, we're looking at a situation here where I think Dalton coming in immediately probably raises the floor while not giving a true ceiling to those players. He has a matchup with the Raiders this week. I think we can pretty much immediately see a team that is more exciting from a fantasy perspective. The downside of that is Andy Dalton, is long past his prime for whatever level that reached, obviously, with Cincinnati. What's your thoughts now on what this means for the Raiders moving forward and their playmakers? Is it something that changes it dramatically for you, or do you still think that it's probably going to be a little bit of a train wreck in Carolina?
Yeah, I think it could be problematic, but if you are stashing Jonathan Brooks like we are in a lot of leagues, if you have some exposure to Deontay Johnson, if you have some exposure to Xavier Legette, then yeah, this is a very positive move. in that Andy Dalton is one of these quarterbacks who has made his weapons viable, even when he himself is probably not a guy you can win a Super Bowl with. Colm, I mentioned in the guillotine write-up that Darnell Mooney, who was one of the guys chopped in our league, had put up a wide receiver 23 season in 2021 with Chicago. That was the season where Justin Fields and Andy Dalton were pulling the trigger. You get a little bit of a sense of what Dalton could help do there. The previous season, he had filled in for the Dallas Cowboys, and while his numbers in general were not as strong as Dak Prescott's, you didn't get the complete collapse that you might have otherwise expected. 65% completions and a similar touchdown rate, which especially for fantasy is the number that you are most interested in there. And then that 2022 season that I mentioned was with the New Orleans Saints. And anybody who has watched the difference between the pre-Clint Kubiak Saints and what's happening this year will know it was probably not that great of an environment, but Dalton ends up in there with an injury to Jameis Winston and then holds the job because he performed so well in that 2022 season. Now holds the job because the expectations were not that high with Winston as the originally intended starter. But this is a guy who has had relatively decent success with 3 different teams in 3 different years. Very much the type of player who can go in, adapt to a new circumstance, and play despite not having had 5, 6, 7 years of rapport with the individual passing weapons.
Yeah, it's still a drastic change from Bryce Young, what you can expect there.
And I think it allows you to do different things. One of the elements that really sort of reared its head when Dalton was with the Bears and with Matt Nagy was there, and there was all of this frustration with Nagy not actually building the offense around the strengths that Justin Fields brought to the table. And I'm sure he and a lot of people would say, well, there just weren't that many strengths. And yet at the same time, again, within the context of what we're seeing just across the board from different players, there are things that Justin Fields could do, should have been allowed to do then, did a little bit more after Nagy's departure, has done a little bit for the Steelers as they get off to their 2-0 start, although that's almost entirely fueled by the defense. But for some of these coaches who don't have the patience or don't have the creativity, don't have the ability to mold the offense to the strengths of their players. And one of the issues with Bryce Young is there just may not be strengths, right? Because you've got a guy who doesn't have that strong of an arm, who has trouble seeing over the line, a player who it now appears was almost entirely fueled by playing in that Alabama offense, playing with someone like a Jameson Williams. I think that there's a strong possibility that some of the guys who are failing right now, like a Bryce Young, that if they get 5, 6, 7 years in the league as a backup, that they could come back and be what a Baker Mayfield is now, what a Geno Smith is now. I don't think it's done forever for them. But Andy Dalton is the kind of guy who can be, this is kind of a weird thing to say, but he can probably be Ryan Fitzpatrick or a poor man's Ryan Fitzpatrick. And when you're talking about having any interest in Carolina Panthers games, any dynamism, any electricity as it relates to what's going to happen with the peripheral pieces, Dalton should be a huge upgrade, just like he was in this situation with Justin Fields several years ago.
Yeah, you go from a situation where they basically can't move the ball to, at least that will be something that they can hope to achieve, sustain some drives. They just were not moving anything really over those opening 2 weeks. Shawn, the next one that you mentioned it earlier, the injury to Pacheco, fractured fibula on IR, likely going to miss 6 to 8 weeks at this point. The Chiefs have signed Kareem Hunt to the practice squad. You obviously have Carson Steele and then Samaje Perine, who was recently acquired as well. When we look through the situation for the backfield, obviously an offense we hope that puts up a huge amount of fantasy points. We've talked a little bit about some of their offensive issues in those opening 2 weeks, particularly week 2. But what's your outlook now on this Chiefs backfield? Do you think it's just going to be a committee approach? Do you think there's one clear back to try and have on your roster? What's your thoughts on the KC Chiefs backfield here moving forward?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a debacle. And especially when the Chiefs are willing to go out and run the ball as much as they did against Cincinnati. Now, Cincinnati is one of those teams like the Packers and the Colts where they simply cannot stop the run at all. And again, may not really want to. But you do go from a player who has continued to ascend, has elite athleticism, has developed some of the running back skills, and is probably a viable starter, to now having a depth chart that looks pretty ugly. And this sort of weird unwillingness of Kansas City to try things. And you say, well, I mean, they're trying things. They've got Carson Steele. They have Samaje Perine. But, I mean, Dalvin Cook was available until very recently. And Dalvin Cook would probably not only be better than Isaiah Pacheco, which, again, most listeners are going to disagree with, but obviously is going to at least have an upside within his range of outcomes that the other players that they have now do not have. And this is a team that met with J.K. Dobbins and then decided to re-sign Clyde Edwards-Helaire. That move, especially with Dobbins then going to the Chargers, now looks like maybe the biggest mistake of the entire offseason. Now, there's an element here where running backs are just so replaceable and so interchangeable that statement probably is not true. And yet, again, why would you have not taken the risk? Why would you have not wanted to see what was behind door number 2? Because you already know that what was behind these other doors doesn't work. So I think those things are disappointing. When we look at Steele, when we look at Perine, those guys are going to form a really low-end committee in all likelihood. The tiny little bit that we've gotten to see from them so far is that Steele will get the rushing attempts, which probably aren't that high value, although, I mean, hopefully the Chiefs spend a lot of time down there inside the 5 over the next several months. Perine will get the receiving work. That part is probably also not that valuable in the Chiefs attack, where when they do pass, they probably want to pass to guys like Rashee Rice, Travis Kelce, hopefully Xavier Worthy. Kareem Hunt is a player. We talk about, guys who are washed up, guys who have poor peripherals. The one person who was below everyone else in the entire NFL last year was Kareem Hunt. And this is a weird situation because they're bringing back a guy that they got rid of when he was at his peak because of trust and behavioral issues. Now you're going to bring him back when last year he was the worst running back in football. I think that some of these moves are pretty frustrating. And the hope that you have is that the Chiefs reevaluate what they're doing, even against teams like the Bengals, who flat out cannot stop the run, and say, let's not get pulled into doing exactly what the opponent wants.
And Shawn, just as we finished recording this one, we did have some breaking news that the Chiefs have added Keontae Ingram to the active roster. So rather than putting him on the practice squad, they put him up to the active roster. We talked a little bit there about Kareem Hunt. He is on the practice squad, so there's lots of moving parts here. Ingram with the Cardinals to start his career, some flashes, but a player that we kind of liked coming out of college, but it didn't all come together in the NFL as of yet. What's your thoughts of how that maybe impacts our discussion there on the Chiefs, or does it really impact it much at all?
It's definitely going to be an impact. Anytime that you have a completely empty depth chart, there is some potential for a player to be interesting. It definitely muddies the waters. Keontae Ingram last year, just the 35 carries for the Arizona Cardinals, poor numbers in yards after contact per attempt. He gets stuffed on almost 43% of those carries.
Not great.
He's a 3% boom rate and almost 6% bust rate. Again, not really what you're looking for. SIS gives him a below average, which not surprising that a back of this caliber would be below average in points above average per play. But when you're looking at Ingram, the positive play percentage, very low. This is a guy that essentially grades as right at replacement level in their stats, which I mean, that's very fairly what the Chiefs are hoping to get from him is replacement level play. I guess I would not expect him to be the guy for them, but when you think about Carson Steele's fumble last week, when you think about how unimpressive Pirine has arguably been in the recent past as a runner, I don't think that you can eliminate any possibilities when you're thinking about that Chiefs backfield.
Shawn, obviously very unfortunate news as well with Tua picking up another head injury. That leads to him being placed on injured reserve. Likely that he is not going to be involved for a little bit of time here moving forward. We'll see if he comes back later in the season. What are your thoughts on the impact to the rest of the offense? I think running the ball will still, be in a similar situation overall with what the Dolphins are trying to do. There is some parts of the Dolphins offense which I do think they were, like, we've praised them in the past for trying to scheme plays for their best players and opening things up and having innovative plays. I think there's times this season so far that they have been doing things for the sake of doing things and kind of overcomplicating some areas of it. Obviously they're going to have to really pare that down with Skylar Thompson. We'll see if any other QBs come into the frame over the next couple of weeks. But what are your thoughts on how much the quarterback change here is going to limit the likes of Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle moving forward here?
It's definitely going to limit them. I think there's a possibility that if Waddle can stay healthy, that maybe he is a very minor beneficiary, because some of the elements that Tyreek Hill brings when you have an elite quarterback, the ability to get behind the defense to score these 70-yard touchdowns, where obviously that touchdown is valuable in a huge way in and of itself. It also takes plays away potentially from other players. Now, perhaps you just end up with additional possessions, right? So that's the flip side of it. But if they need that second weapon more now to open things up. But one of the issues that they were already having over these first couple of weeks is that the injury to Malik Washington, the unavailability of Odell Beckham, has really made them fairly one-dimensional within the context of those top two targets. This wasn't a team that looked like the 2023 version of themselves already. I mean, they were struggling before this injury. It's kind of interesting when you go in and look at the rushing peripherals for someone like Devon Achane, who has seemed to be, astonishingly good. Those are also, according to SIS, maybe not as good as you would hope. Now, his ability to create boom plays, which he's done as both a rusher and a receiver, are a big deal. This is a situation where you really hope that Skylar Thompson has taken a big step forward. Otherwise, the roster construction here is pretty problematic, right? Because you have a quarterback where the risk of injury was heightened. You have a team that is built to compete for the Super Bowl in 2024. We do have quite a few teams really where the backup quarterback is at least viable. And we just discussed one of those with the Carolina Panthers. If Andy Dalton were going to be the QB for Miami, you'd be pretty fired up. Not from the perspective of him being able to do all the things that Tua was able to do, but here's a guy who, similar to Tua, doesn't have the strongest arm, but is going to get the ball out fast, is probably going to successfully read the defense. In favorable context to him, he's going to be successful. If you have wind, if you have rain, if you have an elite defense, if you have a top corner shut down one of his guys, then Andy Dalton is going to look like a backup. But there are going to be situations where he can look really good. We don't really have the sense to this point that there are any environments in which Skylar Thompson will look good. It just moves these guys and Tyreek Hill from being a very valid pick at the 101. I wasn't necessarily taking him there. Some of that, I think, probably just still stems from some of the things that he's done in the past. And the fact that you don't feel that comfortable with a huge amount of Tyreek Hill on your roster. But, I mean, you could make a very strong argument that he should have been the first pick in 2024 drafts. He's now no longer a first round value. I don't think Jalen Waddle no longer that sort of, Jalen Waddle probably was an unreal value at the 3-4 turn. You can argue that now he just falls to being more of a fair value, but it dramatically lowers the ceiling for both of these guys.
Yeah, it's going to be one to obviously watch. I just think that it will hurt them a lot here moving forward, but maybe we do see something like we're hoping to see from Andy Dalton, where they can continue to move the ball, and then with the running backs, they're able to sustain those drives to give those opportunities that you mentioned to add those points. Shawn, there's a couple of wide receivers I want to mention here. I'm going to pair them all together, and then we'll kind of see if there is any changes overall. It might just be that we see a bump in opportunity to other players. You did mention Deebo Samuel earlier with his calf. He will miss a few weeks is what the latest news will be. AJ Brown, similar, a few weeks, whether that's 2 weeks to 4 weeks, we'll have to wait and see. And then we have Cooper Kupp with his ankle. Sean McVay has said that he will miss an extended period of time, so we're in that same category. There has been talk that he could potentially even go on injured reserve. So those particular three names, Shawn, obviously it impacts their offenses, it impacts their owners, but maybe some people are looking at opportunities from the other side. If there's players that could be potentially added in for the sake of the Rams, we now have Puka and Kupp out, so maybe some of the deeper receivers come into play. You mentioned George Kittle. I think he will be somebody who gets the benefit here with the Deebo Samuel injury, but they're also already missing Christian McCaffrey, which again, two massive elements of that offense being removed. Does that open up the door for somebody like Isaiah Guerrero? And then we have AJ Brown, and I feel like that's realistically going to lead the way of Devontae Smith getting that heavier workload. What is there any of those players that there's anything other than it's very unfortunate that they are going to miss time? Is there anything that you think is important for the listeners to have an eye open to?
We've talked a little bit about the contingent upside for someone like a Devontae Smith. Specifically, his splits with and without Dallas Goedert have been pretty severe. You get it without AJ Brown, and possibly the increased defensive attention balances out a little bit of it. But Devontae Smith is absolutely fantastic. He had a shot at a second touchdown in the game on Monday night. He more or less gets open as well. My thesis on him has been that if AJ Brown weren't there, Smith would be a 1-2 turn kind of play. And we'll now get to see that a little bit. I have a pretty decent amount of him. Anytime that something breaks favorably for someone, you wish you had more. That's one of the kind of interesting emotional dynamics, the waves that we ride on, and hit the crest, you get the trough. The
other part of that, Shawn, you mentioned at the start players hitting that you've drafted. I feel like even players that you drafted that are hitting, sometimes you're like, like you're saying, oh, I don't have enough of them. Or the other part is like if there's a player that you avoided, even though like if 80% of what you drafted is going in the right direction, you're like, oh, there's that one player that I drafted that isn't working out. The negative always stands to the forefront of your mind when you're thinking through these things.
Sure, that's always tough. I think that the hardest ones are when you were on someone and then it really hits and you wish you just had even a little bit more. But these things can work their way back the other direction very quickly, right? Because Cooper Kupp was somebody that we really pushed. You get that very unfortunate injury to Puka, and you're thinking, okay, well, Cooper Kupp is now a very clear first-round value and is going to be one of the 2024 league winners. You just get half a game, and he's already in deep trouble. I was looking at a squad that Ben and I drafted in the main event, and it is 2-0, which you're always excited about at this point. I knew that we were losing Cooper Kupp from that game, and then as you're catching up on all of the developments, you find out that Deebo is also somehow out. So you lose both of those guys. Colm, every once in a while, you draft cleanly enough that you appear to be able to weather it. That team also has T. Higgins. And yet the starting lineup this week will include Bijan Robinson, Jackson Smith and Jigba, Jamison Williams, Brock Bowers, George Kittle. You put Jerry Jeudy in there, who hasn't been a world beater, but has been a small win to this point, has 3 different interesting QBs, has the Dallas kicker, who, I mean, obviously it's kind of silly. It's not going to continue, but I mean, he's averaging 21 points a game.
I was about to say he's putting up quarterback points, but when you look at the quarterbacks this season, he's lapping the field.
Yeah, he's crushing those QBs. So, I mean, one of the things you're hoping to do, or that you're hoping you have done, is simply to have draft well enough and draft with the right mindset that you have the ability to weather some of these injuries. This is something that we hammer over again, is that when you are drafting, you have to be willing, or you have to be able to overcome your mistakes and overcome the injuries, beat teams during the bye weeks. That becomes more difficult when you have all of the injuries. But, for that roster, for example, we're hoping that at some point T. Higgins actually does play and Deebo comes back, Cooper Kupp eventually comes back. If you can get some of those teams, if you can get a Kupp team into the race, if you can get a Deebo team, into the sprint, if you can get a T. Higgins team in, then suddenly you're looking really good. So one of the things that I would recommend people think about and be excited for is this opportunity that if you have drafted a juggernaut and you're having some injuries, there are situations in which if you are in some tournaments that could actually be to your benefit, right? It's going to take out a lot of the teams that are similar. You may enter the race for the big money with not only a unique lineup, but arguably a power lineup, right? One of these super lineups where once those guys get healthy again, your team is almost unstoppable, at least from a projected points perspective. Any given 3-game span, you can have some crazy performances that launch other teams and maybe neutralize some of the things that you have in place. But that's what you're looking to do. You're looking to build this super team.
One word answer, Shawn. You mentioned T. Higgins. Sounds like he is likely to be back in NFL Week 3. Can you trust T. Higgins in NFL Week 3?
On a scale of 1 to 100, I mean, is that like a 0? I mean, I'm rooting
7,
for him.
Maybe
a 7 out of 100. I love him. I hope things work out for him. We're obviously in prove it territory, both with Higgins specifically and with the Bengals in general.
Yeah, we'll see what happens there. In Dynasty, I have just so much Higgins, and every week you're like, well, just can't put him in. Then he's healthy, and you're like, can you put him in? So we'll see what happens. Hopefully he will be healthy heading in, but they get a prime matchup, Shawn, in terms of if the Bengals can get right, the Commanders on Monday Night Football is an appetizing place for them to do that. That is going to kind of get us to the end of this edition where we work through some of the scenarios around the league and what to do moving forward. We are, as Shawn mentioned earlier, going to have kind of a guillotine league episode where we talk through some of our teams, our movements, our strategies, what you kind of want to be looking at there. But the other part I think is going to be interesting. We're going to be looking through some of Shawn's article that's up on rotoviz.com talking about it, but there's a lot of conversation in it about targeting those players that get cut by the team that falls to the guillotine, but also leading to a good conversation, I think, around waiver wires, how to make those decisions. Shawn, in the Scott Fish Bowl a couple of weeks ago, I put in 2 waiver wire bids. One was for P. Ryan, the other was for Jordan Mason. It had never happened before, and before I had even seen the transactions, there was 4 people in the league that had commented in to say that it was like one of the more unfortunate scenarios they had, where I had put in the exact same bid amount for the 2 players as the other betting team, but I just, the time stamped it. It's quite unfortunate to pick that same number. I like to pick some kind of random numbers like 37 or 33, but anyway, we missed out. But we are going to talk about some strategy. Maybe Shawn can point me in the right direction for what I need to do the next time to get those players on my roster. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me over on Twitter at @OvertimeMartin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of his work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one. Good to jump straight in, Shawn, to the second one?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things I was looking at a little bit
And the other thing, I did take a note. I don't know if you noticed it when I said about the winning touchdown in that Lions game being a rushing touchdown from Mayfield. That was in the third quarter. So I'll cut out that portion where I mentioned about it being the winning score.
Yeah, let me. Are you ready to know? I need to do a little, probably a little rescue of the Andy Dalton segment there.
Okay.